Aristotle believed man's character was built by habit, but only if it was intentional and chosen. However, I am standing in the northwestern corner of New York at the corner of the Adirondacks in front of the DeBar Pond Lounge. This popular camping spot was popping during the 70s, but today it is completely abandoned. I found it just by happenstance, and look at how beautiful this place is. I'm going to take you up to the top here, but let's go ahead and get these introductions out of the way. Good evening, everybody. It is your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. And so far, the Adirondacks I've enjoyed a little more than the Appalachians, actually. There's more beautiful stuff like what's behind me here. And then I want you to check this out. This massive lounge, but it's all boarded up. And that shack down there is totally closed up too. Now, we do have a topic to cover today, which is the Nichomachean ethics, Aristotle's practical manual on how we can be the best version of ourselves, or pursue eudaimonia, which means flourishing. So, to recap, in Book 1, Aristotle defines what the study of ethics is about. And we're just at it in front of this really cool abandoned thing. And then check out this swing right here. So for him, it's a practical subject, and he was writing it to inform politicians. He mentions it a lot in the first book. Also in the first book, he defines eudaimonia as the aim of ethics, or how to be happy, defining it as a life of intentional virtue. He also mentions the study of human behavior, as with ethics, cannot be precise like mathematics practiced by the Egyptians, but this doesn't matter, and we should be happy with the results of our studies as long as the results are good enough. And he concludes the first book by reiterating a serious or supidolius, I'm not great at pronouncing the Greek, a serious person, human being, is going to live a virtuous life because it makes them feel good and it's rewarding to themselves. And they're also going to be self-sufficient. They're not going to be a hermit, totally isolated from the world. They're going to try to interact with people both on an individual and on a political level. Again, now dude, there's like a greenhouse around the backside of here. After thoroughly defining the goal of ethics studying, he moves on to book 2 and 5, where he talks more about what virtue is. So in book 2, Aristotle quickly distinguishes between moral and intellectual virtues. Moral virtues are also known as virtues of character. And the biggest, and see, check out how big this lounge is. And then just like this path here. I haven't seen anybody here. I've walked around several times. There's like another little side lounge. We'll walk over near it. Intellectual virtues can be taught by a teacher and can be acquired just by like learning through a book, whereas virtues of character, moral virtues, are the results of habitual action. And if you guys remember, Aristotle has a few quotes from book 2 where he says things along the lines of to become a good builder, you've got to build well like a good builder, so you become what you do. And he does the same thing with harpists and other artisans, as they would call them. But he also says that if you practice things badly, by saying a person that builds bad stuff is just going to become a bad builder. So again, virtue of character, on the other hand, is the result of developing the right habits. Aristotle's view is that everyone has the potential for all these virtues, but our nature determines whether we express them. And that's something he does say towards the end of the second book of the Nichomachean Ethics, and it reminds me of phenotype and genotype. For any of you biologists out there, you know that just because you possess the trait for something does not mean that you'll express it. Sometimes they're environmentally stimulated expression patterns, and other times it's just like you either have it or you don't. But most things involving people are happen to be more complicated for whatever reason. Book 2's conclusion was that virtues exist as the golden mean between extremes. If you guys remember from my video on Book 2, we talked about how cowardice is the lack of courage, but rashness or recklessness is the excess of courage, and that a truly courageous man is going to have a little bit of both. Now, we're approaching some kind of other structure here. Let's see what's over here. Huh. Man, this reminds me almost of Resident Evil 4. If you guys have ever played that video game when Leon Kennedy is over in I think Spain or something like that. And now in books 3 and 5, he starts giving us some real specific examples on what is virtuous behavior, what isn't virtuous behavior, and breaking down like the practical aspects of it. But let me readjust my stuff here. There's also a greenhouse up here we're going to walk by. So in book 3, he talks about the nature of action. And here's a quote from the first part of book 3, Becker translation. Virtue, however, is concerned with emotion and action, and it is only voluntary feelings and actions for which praise and blame are given. So he starts talking about which actions should be commendable, things that were praiseworthy, which ones should be pitied, and which ones are neutral. And he differentiates between voluntary and involuntary actions. Involuntary actions are done through ignorance or compulsion. Now, he's not talking about like a compulsive behavior like an addict would do it. He gives an example in the first part of the third book about like a ship captain who has his family taken hostage. If he does something bad with his crew to rescue his family, that he was under compulsion. That's not something that we can judge the man's virtue for, because he had an external force applied to him. So the only things that we can really judge people for are things that are internally generated and voluntary expressions of their character. But yeah, here is the greenhouse. And another quote from the third book, Becker translation, line 11 or 1110b. An act done through ignorance is in every case not voluntary, but it is involuntary only when it causes the agent pain and regret. Since a man who has acted through ignorance and feels no compunction at all for what he has done cannot indeed be said to have acted involuntarily, as he has not said sorry for it. So somebody can only be, like, if you mess up because of you were ignorant, which happens to us all more usually whenever we're younger, but and you genuinely are sorry for it and you express it through your actions, then we should forgive you. But if you're not sorry for it and you continue making those same mistakes over and over and over again, despite being told the consequences, and you show no remorse for it, then it's not forgivable in Aristotle's eyes. That's a conclusion I think a lot of us might see was self-evident. And the main point of book 3 is ignorance versus compulsion. He defines what exactly an ignorant person is. He goes into like philosophical extreme lengths to define it, but suffice to say, if you were unaware that your actions would cause you pain or regret before doing them, and you were clear-minded, then in Aristotle's eyes, that was an ignorant action. Again, only if you have the qualifier of actually being remorseful afterwards. And then compulsion, it's like if you have an external force applied to you, like if somebody was ransoming your family. He also talks about voluntary versus involuntary actions, or the Greek versions, ekousion or akousion. So, voluntary actions are ones that we choose and we know what the consequences of them will be. Involuntary actions may be actions that we choose, but they're ones that we may not know the consequences of. And he goes into proairesis, 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 in English, deliberate choice. This is the type of decision or action that reflects the person's character the most. Again, pro Aries, in English, deliberate choice. These are things that we know the consequences of. We know what's going to happen. We do them anyways. It could be good or bad, but they're the ones that reflect who we are internally the most. And Aristotle can be pretty savage. In chapter 5 of book 3, he says, while no one blames those who are ill-formed by nature, referring to like the way people look, ill-formed by nature, people do censure those who are that way through lack of exercise and neglect. So he's saying we may not judge people who are ugly because of genetics, but if they are not good looking because they don't exercise, we censure them. Today that would be what canceling. We cancel them. That would be the modern equivalent. And then also Becker translation of Nichomachean Ethics, book 3, 11:13a. It appears to be pleasure that misleads the mass of mankind, for it seems to them to be a good, though it is not. So, again, I think a lot of times whenever these ancient people talk about pleasure, they're what like biblical people would call sins of the flesh, or a modern scientist might call dopamine-driven activities, or at least dopamine opioidergic, the dopamine opioid reward pathways, the mesolimbic cortical systems. However, they understood the implications of the underlying neurology even back then, even though at the time they didn't even necessarily think the thoughts came from our brains. So a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers believed that our thoughts and emotions arose in our heart for whatever reason. Another major conclusion of book 3 is that vices are just as voluntary as virtues. So if somebody chooses to be a bad person or do bad things, whatever that is, and they know the consequences and they continue to do them, then they might just not be that great of a person, unfortunately, and that's the way the world is, at least in Aristotle's eyes. But again, he does give us agency, so if you are someone who's habitually viceful or commits vices too often, then he also is speaking a message of empowerment. It's more about knowing what the right choices are. And if you don't know what the right choices are, then you're ignorant. And those are Aristotle's words, not mine. I'm pretty nice, or I try to be. And then in the second half of book 3, he covers specific examples of virtues. We'll go over one that I've touched on a couple of times. I've made a whole video on it for the Stoic philosophy series. But andreia, or courage. So basically from book 4 and 5, and the rest of book 3, he goes over a whole matrix or framework for all of the existing virtues, almost like a periodic table, but for virtuous behavior. And he shows what happens when in excess, what happens in deficiency. But again, dude, look at how amazing this spot is. And we'll conclude here. Man, part of me wants to try to get inside of that building. But again, so we're talking about courage, andreia, and he contrasts it, saying that it's concerned with fear, or in Greek, phobos, who was said to run amok on the battlefield back in the day, by the way, phobos, god of fear. And then continence, or thrasos. Andreia, courage, is the mean between these extremes. An excess of confidence manifests in two types. You get foolhardy people who aren't sure what they're doing, but they're overconfident about it anyways, and they might get hurt. Think about the kind of guy who's like, hold my beer, and then he goes and does something with like a skateboard, and gets hurt. And then rash or reckless behavior. Stuff where you don't examine the consequences that might happen to yourself or the people around you, but you do it anyways. And a deficiency is cowardly behavior, or in the ancient Greek, delos. So, yeah, and we will continue going through the rest of this. He goes on and creates a framework for all of the virtues, and that little bit I gave you about courage just there is just a tiny bit. He goes into major depth, but this stuff does take a long time to research, and traveling and hiking like I am takes a lot of time too, on top of actually trying to work. But yeah, so I found this place. I drove to Adirondack Park, but I couldn't get in, like the road was closed, and I got off Google on my phone, and I had no service. And then as soon as I actually got service, there was a little button on Google, just clicked it. It took me to this dirt road in the middle of nowhere, where somewhere where, like, I've been in very populated areas for a long time for the last few days, and there was no population here. And it took me down about a mile-long dirt road in the middle of nowhere. Now, it was dry, otherwise I would not have risked it in my car, but whenever I got there basically was no signs of civilization. I walk through the woods shortly, and this is what appears, and there's nobody here, man. And so far, everywhere I've been in New York has been crowded, even like the nature-y spots. Now, I will tell you, I'm in Ontario County, so I'm almost as far north as you can go and still be in the United States. And that's why I'm wearing a jacket. It's finally starting to be cold. You can kind of tell the trees are starting to change a little bit differently. But my takeaways from the Nichomachean Ethics, book 3, for you guys today: virtuous behavior and vice or bad behavior are both voluntary. They're both things that we have control over, but you have to be aware of what they are. And you've got to want or be intentional. Things that you have no control over, you can't fault a man for. But if you have control over them and you refuse to do anything about them, then in Aristotle's eyes, you're at fault. Virtue of character is something that you develop through right action, as Aristotle says. And it's something that you have to know what the right actions are, but if you want to be a brave person, you just got to start doing brave stuff over and over again. If you want to be a smart person, just start doing what a smart person would do. If you want to be a builder, start acting like a builder. Anyways, that's really all I've got for you guys today. This is a wandering author coming at you from from the northeastern corner of the Adirondack Mountains in New York State, at an abandoned park that I said the name of at the beginning of the video, and I will definitely put a link in the description. Totally blanked on the name for you guys. Reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing to inspire, uplift, and empower your community today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part, and you can count on me to do mine daily. Until next time, I love y'all.